Hi everyone and welcome to Cranjus' Corner. Today, we'll be talking about the tactical battle in games 1 and 2 between the Lakers and Suns when it came to Phoenix's ball screens. Both teams adjusted a ton in an attempt to hold the edge in Phoenix's top offensive action. And disappointingly, I haven't seen anyone really talk about it. So we're here today to break down, punch for punch, the impressive tactics and adjustments that Frank Vogel and Monty Williams made on those ball screens. Let's dive in. To start game 1, the Lakers opened with their regular season default catch or soft hedge pick and roll defense. This is a coverage that's softer than a trap or a show and recover, but gets the defense 2 defenders on the ball with the big up high enough to take away pull-up jumpers and deter drives before they can get started. Check out my deep dive video breakdown of LA's catch hedge scheme from a few months ago if you want to learn more. After just one ball screen, where Ayton ended up being open inside but Booker wasn't ready for LA's catch hedging, Phoenix quickly oriented themselves properly to beat that coverage and worked to take advantage of the 4v3 situation they temporarily have off ball. Most plays, they'd align themselves in a way where instead of a 4v3, they'd be attacking a 2v1, and that ball handler had an easy read to attack one defender who should always be wrong. That ball handler would attack laterally, buying time for the roll man to get downhill, and create angles to open up either a lob pass or often a corner 3. This generated buckets and good looks, even if Phoenix missed some shots and some reads. And it's a good way to use Chris Paul's passing well and not ask him to score if his shoulder isn't feeling great. Another way the Suns attacked this defense was stringing the hedge out laterally, enough that the guard defender needed to just peel off and go switch. This was able to expose the Lakers' big men like Andre Drummond and Montrezl Harrell to matchups against quicker guards like Devin Booker, Cam Payne, and Chris Paul. The Lakers' first adjustment was to start rotating early. DeAndre Ayton is a good enough lob threat that you can't just tag him with an arm. You need to get in front of him and belly up to that roll. So the Lakers, whenever possible, would start rotating early whenever they had 2 defenders on the weak side. One would move into tag, and the other would zone up those 2 weak side shooters and do it in a proactive rather than reactive manner. To counter this, the Suns ran a lot more actions either with handoffs, pin downs, or just straight up ball screens where they had 2 in a row on the perimeter. Those 2 screens created situations and alignments where the Lakers couldn't have those 2 weak side defenders, so they couldn't make that pre-rotation and easily recover to skip passes. The Suns did this to end quarter 2 and begin quarter 3 with 5 of 6 pick and rolls attacking catch hedges in this manner. The one tweak the Lakers did try before abandoning was to just leave that weak side shooter open. They did this a couple times, and by doing so, they were able to take away the lob. They did leave shooters wide open, and pretty good shooters at that, but because it's in the rearview mirror of the ball handler, the Lakers were able to get away with it. They didn't continue this because it's very, very beatable if predictable, but it was a really quick tweak from Vogel. One counter that the Suns also tried was 4 times in the second half. After not doing it at all in the first half, they ran Spain action, or counters to it. This is a play where the screener in the pick and roll then receives a back screen from a shooter. That frees him up to the rim, and then the counter off of that would be that screener, instead of receiving the back screen, setting a down screen for a shooter like Devin Booker to come up to the top of the key. This screened that catch hedging big on some plays. On other plays, it just created confusion and prevented help defense from being there to back up the big man and made the Lakers look bad a few times. By this point, those several tactics had beaten up the Lakers defense and forced Frank Vogel, who at that point was out of cards in his hand, to transition away from catch hedging altogether. For the rest of the Q3 and into the fourth quarter, the Lakers adjusted to running drop coverage instead of catch hedging. Now, this ended up being a really positive thing for the Lakers because at that point, once they made that shift, the pick and roll offense for Phoenix generated 0.52 points per possession for the rest of the game after scoring 1.27, just a blistering pace of scoring prior to that change. Just in that first game, we saw both teams engage in a masterful tactical battle of if the Lakers could continue catch hedging or not. Phoenix targeted LA's coverage in specific ways, to which the Lakers adjusted, to which the Suns countered, to which LA countered, to which Phoenix countered on high volume, and enough that Vogel was out of cards to play and needed to switch coverages to drop. But after that change, it was the Suns who were unprepared and struggling to score efficiently. This was an interesting game one and sets up game two very, very well. Moving to game two, from the first play of the game, the Lakers showed that they had come up with a couple new ideas with their few days off to try to continue catch hedging. On the first play, with the man tagging early, instead of going to tag the roll, they sent in a help defender in Anthony Davis to take away the drive, and this let the big man defender in the action not even need to try to hedge. This was an interesting move, but the Lakers didn't go back to it. On the next play, we saw no proactive rotating. Then on the third play, we saw both weak side defenders move over to tag early on the roll and late on the roll. Phoenix quickly adjusted to this and went back to those double screen actions that had scored 1.2 points per possession against the Lakers in game one. This immediately pushed the Lakers to drop. And they didn't go back to catch hedging until the very end of the game with Anthony Davis a few times. From that point on, game two became a tactical battle around LA's high drop coverage. The Bigs' job was no longer to defend laterally, but instead to still show high, but then retreat and defend the rim. Instead of LA's no man behind drop coverage from last season, which kept the action as a 2v2 action and relied on strong shot blocking at the rim, the Lakers kept their bigs higher, but still used tags behind them to defend against lobs, since Gasol and Drummond are going to struggle a little bit to defend lobs if they're even a little bit out of the right position. And surprisingly, for the rest of quarter one, even though the Lakers had shown Phoenix that they'd go to drop coverage at the end of game one, the Suns had no discernible plan against LA's drop coverage. They scored just 3 points on 5 possessions, in addition to having 5 more ball screens completely negated by the Lakers' drop coverage. But from the very first play of the second quarter, the Suns showed that they had a better game plan to attack LA's drop coverage, which was used for 27 of 29 second quarter and third quarter ball screens. To do this, the Suns utilized 4 major concepts. The first concept the Suns used were those same double screens that beat the catch hedging in game one, just used against the drop. The idea was to, again, create those 2v1 looks for the ball handler to facilitate, either with a lob or a corner three-point shooter, just with them making that read while dribbling downhill against the drop instead of dribbling laterally like in game one versus the catch hedging. Since the Lakers were having their big show a little bit higher on the drop and relied on that back end coverage against the lobs, the Suns also a few times went to a single weak side defender look instead of having 2 defenders on that weak side. This made it much harder for the Lakers to tag that roll man and opened up some lobs. These 2 things made Gasol and Drummond look a bit more vulnerable and led to several plays where their slow-footedness plus a sudden lack of help behind them that they were expecting led to buckets or really good looks for the Suns. The third concept, and one that the Suns particularly used late third quarter and early fourth quarter, was that same Spain action that they used in the first game. Sometimes the back screen would happen, sometimes it would be the down screen counter, and a lot of times Booker was just faking around one way or another in a way that his man did not want to leave him to help and tag, and by putting them in that position, it kept other weak side defenders from feeling it was their responsibility to tag. The fourth concept, and another one that we saw in game one, was the Suns finding ways to create switches. But instead of dribbling east-west to string out a catch hedge and force switches like they did in the first game, this game they would attack downhill but keep their dribble alive and then retreat to the perimeter again on the other side of the court, bringing that new matchup with the big man with them to the perimeter to then attack, or then posting up Ayton on a Lakers guard. And what really changed as this game progressed was less the Lakers adjusting to those more specific counters and more the Suns just running them more. When the Suns were just running ball screens without attacking one of those 4 concepts, they were not scoring efficiently. They only scored 0.61 points per possession, but when they were utilizing those concepts, they were just blowing the doors off the Lakers defense. to the point where in the fourth quarter, they were scoring 1.4 points per possession and forced Frank Vogel to finally go to an Anthony Davis at the 5 lineup, get some more switchability in there, and shut down the Suns defense for the Lakers to make one final push. After closing with it in Game 2, the Lakers went right back to that drop coverage to start Game 3. The issue for the Suns then became an inherent disadvantage against that drop coverage, because Devin Booker is a 31% pull-up three-point shooter on the season and was missing them in this game, and Chris Paul, who had made them on the season, was struggling due to his shoulder injury. This made drop coverage a default advantage for the Lakers if the Suns were to just go out and play ball. Instead, they needed to go to specific concepts and sets to counter this defense, and we see this in the results. The Suns scored only 0.94 points per possession, with no concepts run against the drop, but 1.23 points per possession utilizing those specific sets to attack the drop coverage. When it came to the Spain action, the Suns also didn't have much success. They ran it a few times and scored 0.88 points per possession, which is very poor offense, with the Lakers switching and negating a lot of these actions. They did run one counter with a pin down for the opposite corner three-point shooter, which only really worked because LeBron James fell asleep defensively and was cheating in a little bit more than he needed to, given how LA was defending those sets. Overall, Vogel had a decisive edge and shut down what was a key action for the Suns earlier in the series. Double screens also showed up in this game, early in Q2 with 6 points and 4 possessions, so the Lakers countered. They started showing and recovering more often and forcing the ball handler to not even use that second screen. Before this adjustment on the game, the Suns were scoring 1.8 points per possession from this action, but afterwards they had 2 points, 3 empty trips, and then 4 additional negated ball screens after that adjustment. Again, Vogel has a decisive edge in this tactical battle. Again, edge Vogel in this element of the tactical battle for this game. One concept that Monty reintroduced into the series was setting the Lakers up where they only had one player to tag or try to stay home on a shooter, rather than 2, so the Lakers could rotate, zone up, and then scramble to recover. They scored once, had another one negated, and this ended up being a small edge for Monty, but one that wasn't really pressed from a volume standpoint. Overall, Monty found a new edge, but Vogel shut down a few key existing ones, making this game one that Vogel won from an X's and O standpoint in this element of the game. In Game 4, the Suns tried to use more double screens, but LA's rate of countering them with switches or showing them recovering was even higher than in Game 3, which lowered the Suns' efficiency and led them to using this concept the least of any game in the series. They had 8 total attempts, 1 make, 1 miss, and 6 negated. The edge here goes decisively to Vogel. When it came to the Spain action that had plagued the Lakers earlier in the series, but Vogel had shut down pretty well, the Suns did try it again here. Only a few times, the least of any game in the series, and their efficiency dropped substantially for the 3rd game in a row as LA clamped down on this concept with continued switching. The most interesting element of this game was Phoenix leaning into a concept they'd only used a few times in the first 3 games, but 8 times in Game 4, and that was attacking single tags. They put the Lakers in situations where one defender either had to tag a roll man or stay home on a shooter. And the Suns came in ready to build on the 1.38 points per possession, just blistering scoring, that had scored last game by flashing their weak side shooter middle the first time they ran this concept, banking on LA helping off of that man the way they did last game. Phoenix immediately got 2 good shots, so the Lakers adjusted and began stunting to slow down a drive and allowing their big man to stay home on the roll, thus allowing that weak side player to not need to make that tag decision. LA's adjustment was those stunts, and then Phoenix countered that Laker adjustment by driving once catching against that stunting player and into that crease or back cutting that stunt. They got 2 scores on 2 plays from this. The Lakers then countered by removing that stunt, tagging the single side, and then covering the leftover open shooter on the weak side with the ball handler's defender. We even see on that play where the Lakers took this new approach, the Suns tried to back cut that stunt, but the Lakers took a different route, and thus this didn't really create much advantage. After LA's final adjustment, the Suns scored once and had 3 plays shut down. The edge went back and forth throughout the game with this concept, but Vogel had the last laugh. In Game 4, we also saw Monty grab even deeper into his bag of tricks, pulling out empty side ball screens, which we saw twice, not on high enough volume to create all that much trouble, but something that the Lakers hadn't quite solved yet and might play a big role in the series moving forward. The Suns also went into this game ready to attack the fact that Anthony Davis was switching purposefully, immediately, willingly in some ball screens. To counter this, the Suns ran a ghost screen to get a nice shot attempt for Crowder. It didn't work, but it was a good way to get him a good look. And with Anthony Davis out, this really might not matter too much moving forward, but this was a small edge that the Suns were able to create and can counter that more auto switching with Anthony Davis in ball screen situations. Overall in Game 4, we saw a few small wins for Monty, 2 decisive Vogel wins, and a complex back and forth battle that Vogel ultimately won, giving him the tactical edge in this element of this game of the series. If we wanted to tally up which coach has the edge in this element of the series so far, I think we can look game by game. In Games 1 and 2, I'd give the edge to Monty. In Games 3 and 4, I'd give the edge to Vogel. And while I'd say the series is 2-2 overall, from a coaching standpoint in this respect, I would say that Vogel probably has the current edge. Just based on shutting down the Spain action, the forcing switches, those single tag plays, the double screens, all of those things that the Suns were using at different points in the series to score pretty efficiently. With those shut down and really with just the empty side ball screens left to solve, I'd say the Lakers are in a pretty good position. I do expect to see the Suns press that a lot in Game 5 until the Lakers do solve it, and when they do solve it, it's probably going to look like some pre-rotation from the weak side and zoning up against the numbers advantage Phoenix will have on the other end of the court, which Phoenix will likely then try to counter with pin and flare screens or cutting reactively against this movement, or they may try to be proactive, prevent that help, and do so by using staggered screens or other actions to occupy those would-be defenders to then open up the roles on that empty side. Thanks for joining me into this deep dive look on Crangis's Corner and into just this one action, but it's one action that has scored 170 of the 396 total points for the Suns so far through 4 games, which is 43% of all of their points scored just on that one action. So we'll see what happens over the next few games, but check back into Crangis's Corner and we will dive in once we do see what goes on between these two excellent tactical coaching staffs. I'm glad you were able to join me as we took a deeper dive into that game within the game. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you next time here on Crangis's Corner.